Morning, everyone. Happy Mondays. Welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's associate editor, Jason Beattie. Morning, Jason.
Morning, Susie. How are you?
Hi, I'm all right. Thank you very much. So this is the People's Pay-Per-View. Please get into the comments. Let us know what you're thinking and we'll do our best to answer your questions for you. Those of you listening later on podcast are just going to have to tell everyone it was an early draft and you never meant to send it. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the fact that a couple of high-profile Tories have backed the nurses' strike. More on that a bit later. But first, I want to take you to page 6, where the first black woman in Parliament, Diane Abbott, has been suspended from the Labour Party after writing a letter about racism and then saying she didn't mean any of it. Now, Jason, can you take us through this? Diane Abbott has battled and been a victim of racism all her life. So what's she done here?
So she wrote a letter to the Observer, which rather embarrassing for the Observer. They seem to have missed the news story themselves, about an article written by somebody else, which was kind of saying that racism comes in many different forms, and very cack-handedly and ill-judged, Diane Abbott I'm trying to be kind to her here, tried to make the point that yes, there are various forms of racism, but actually comparing the kind of the abuse suffered by, she took the example of redheads, travellers, and then very unfortunately Jewish people, said was not comparable to the suffering of the black people from the historic legacy of slavery. I think I know what she was on about, but you know, there is a difficulty in drawing a comparison, let's say, between being a redhead, and as a father of two redheads, I'm sympathetic to that cause. But putting in kind of the Jewish people and kind of ignoring the historic anti-Semitism over many, many centuries, and most obviously, but kind of, you know, but horrific persecution by the Nazis and the 6 million people who died in the Holocaust, what was very badly judged and offensive. And there's no excuse for this. And I mean, she accepts that and has apologized. Her excuse that it was a draft letter, I'm not entirely convinced about, but maybe that did happen. But as you say, there's a sadness here, and the sadness here is that Diane Abbott has probably suffered more racist, and kind of misogynistic abuse than any other MP. I mean, if you ever look at the comments on her Twitter feed, they're absolutely abhorrent. And this is what makes it so difficult, is that, and rather a bitter irony, is that the person who has faced more hatred and abuse than anybody else failed to understand that her own language could be.
Yeah, I didn't hear all of that. I'm not sure if it's your signal or mine, Jason.
There's a little bit of silence at the end, Susie, for some reason.
Yeah, maybe it's my new auto cue software, which isn't working very well. Who knows? But I think we got your point anyway. She's suffered a lot of racism, and she doesn't seem to have quite grasped the different nuances of different groups of people who have different experiences. And it, you know, she did point out in this letter that, you know, there were no people who seemed to be white, i.e. Jewish people or travellers, on the slave ships, and so therefore it wasn't the same kind of experience. Doesn't really quite, it's not really what comparator, is it? Is this do you think this is a reasonable reaction from the Labour Party? What do you think, viewers? Do you think this is the right thing to have done, to have suspended Diane for having said this? I mean, she's apologised extremely quickly. If you want to compare it to Jeremy Corbyn and how long it took him to not apologise, she's done amazingly well to turn it back straight away, immediately reverse the ferret. But it doesn't seem to have worked with Keir Starmer. Now, Lazy says, the Labour leadership have acted swiftly. Diane has at least apologised. It's quite a contrast when compared to the dim dom debacle of the past week or so, of course, referring to Dominic Raab's bullying thing. But Jason, is it reasonable? Because, I mean, someone's not towed the line, all right? They've made the party look bad, so we need to dissociate ourselves from it and suspend her from their point of view. But from the other hand, does it just reignite all those headlines, all the division we've had about the Labour Party and anti-Semitism over years, about the Corbyn era, bring all this back into our lives again when we'd much rather it wasn't? Would Starmer conceivably have been better off just ignoring it and letting the apology be the apology?
Unfortunately, I don't think he could ignore it. I mean, even though she had apologised, that you can't, given Labour's historic problems of anti-Semitism and Starmer's pledge on his first day as leader to root out that poison from the party, if he just stood by, then he would have become under a lot of attack, and it would have been seen as kind of a weakness on his behalf, and that would have reignited the whole issue. I mean, I think some of the right-wing papers here are going, Labour is once again embroiled in anti-Semitism rows are slightly unfair. It's one MP. You can't, tarnish a whole party because of the actions of one MP who's made a mistake and has used, unacceptable formulation of language. But it's in the right's interest to stir that up. And I can see why they're doing it. I think it's slightly unfair. I mean, the bit I find difficult here is that Diane is an awkward person. I know her quite well.
She's a funny fish, isn't she?
She's a funny fish. She is. She's quite shy. I don't think people get this. And she's not as confident as you'd sometimes imagine. And sometimes, she's you've got to admire a lot for what she did. As you said, the first Black woman in Parliament, overcoming incredible kind of prejudice, has kind of been a kind of amazing trailblazer in many, many ways, risen kind of, to shadow cabinet level. But there's so much to admire about Diane, but also, she's her own worst enemy and always has been, but she's kind of charges of hypocrisy have been placed against her where, she kind of, she's always been on the left of the party, which is fine because, there's space in the party for people with those views, but she's also kind of supported causes which are sometimes quite difficult to justify. And she, people are complicated, and Diane is a complicated person. And sometimes I think there needs to be a bit of nuance here and a little bit of understanding. But trying to just I feel this applies to all politicians, but particularly in this case, that if you try and just kind of say they are just one simple thing and pigeonhole them like that, is to do a kind of a disservice to somebody who's actually a very complicated character, and with complicated characters come all different shades and all different opinions.
Exactly, and someone who could achieve all the things that she had done in the wake of the face of all that objection and prejudice is going to be unusual, shall we say, to start with, in the way that they deal with some of the word, as an awful lot of trailblazers will have been. Now, Tim says it's completely lazy. It just has the same label being hurled around, and it does a huge injustice to real anti-Semitism. Gwyneth says she should resign because her views are opposite to what the Labour Party now stands for. She's toxic. It's got to be remarked upon, hasn't it, Jason, that even the hard left, the Corbynistas, the people who made such a fuss about anti-Semitism in the party over the past few years, they aren't defending this. They're not coming out, at least they weren't when I came on air here. They're not coming out and saying, God save Diane. I think the founder of Momentum has said something, but, Corbyn himself even, they've all been fairly quiet, really. And they've said that it's fairly indefensible. Is it possible, do you think, that Momentum and the activists on that side of the party have realised that their fronts, facing people, their leaders, are being slowly ejected by Starmer, that this kind of thing gives them exactly the gunpowder that the other side of the party needs to clear it out? It might be wise perhaps to keep a low profile for a bit, just wind it in slightly rather than caused the big fuss and noise they have done over the past few
This
years?
is really fascinating, something you've picked on here. So if you talk to those on the left of the party, but what they call the campaign group, of this kind of a hardcore of holders of the Jeremy Corbyn kind of torch, so to speak, that they are very fearful at the moment that the leadership is looking for any excuse to drive them out of the party, and they say they accuse kind of Starmer's team of almost setting traps for them to find a mechanism to get them out. They are keeping a low profile precisely because of this, because they fear that if they are driven out, then they lose all influence on what happens if Labour was to win the next general election.
So
but
perhaps
what's fascinating here is one of the reasons they're keeping a low profile is if it's a hung parliament, then they suddenly have leverage, because Corbyn, or even if Corbyn has a small majority, they have leverage, because Corbyn won't be able to get any legislation through without having the whole support of all the MPs. So suddenly you get a handful of MPs, you don't need 3 or 4 who could completely change the terms of debate, because they're saying, we're not going to support you, you'll get your legislation through, maybe you're going to listen to us. So they are in some ways playing a long game here. And it partly explains why you're not seeing them running to the barricades in support of Corbyn and Diane Abbott.
All right, so they're taking the long-term view to wind their necks in a little bit publicly now, wait till Labour comes into power, and then perhaps start, using the back corridors of power, as it were, to exert influence over the next Labour government. Tim says there's certainly a purge happening at the moment. The silence is not surprising. It's fear. From what Jason just said, Tim, it's not fear, it's long-termism. Michael says left-wingers are held to a higher standard. If it was a right-wing centrist MP with an apology, it would have been forgotten about. If it was a Tory that had written something like this, if it was one of Starmer's sort of side of the party who had written something like this and there was a very quick apology, has Michael got a point? Would that have been allowed to slide? Or is this the excuse they wanted to suspend Diane? Sorry, Jason.
I think this is always the case. The left are always held. We're struggling a bit here, Susie, aren't we?
Yeah, it's your Wi-Fi, I think.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, don't worry, but we got you mid-cup of tea there, mid-swig. Do you think this is... do you think what Michael's point there was...
I think this is... I think he's got a very good point. The left is always held to a higher standard. And in some ways you could argue they should be, because their values matter to them. But it's a case of the hypocrisy of having a kind of a predominantly right-wing press, which is always going to gun for Labour and always pick on even the slightest kind of misdemeanor or lapse. I'm not saying Diane Abbott's was a slight misdemeanor. I'm just saying that's what they would do. And as such, Labour has to will always come under more criticism. And they have to kind of but I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think left should be held to a higher standard of account. It's good. It shows their values are stronger. Because
you think the right is not going to stand up to quite the same amount of scrutiny. Yeah, well, we'll have to wait and see how things turn out for Diane, won't we? And whether that apology actually turns out to be enough in the long run. Now we need to go on to the big story of the day. Keep asking us your questions about Diane Abbott, everybody. What do you think about her suspension? Do you think she had a point in her letter, or do you think she should just have the benefit of the doubt? It was an early draft that got sent in that shouldn't have got sent in. Whoops-a-daisy. And she's apologised very quickly. What more could anybody do in the absence of a time machine? But let us know. We'll try and wrap at the end. But now to the big story of the day. And it's been said before, right, that Rod Stewart, who for those of you watching on YouTube used to be a singer and a tax exile, used some of his millions to pay a little while ago for some MRI scans in his hometown of Harlow in Essex. And at the time, he gave interviews saying the COVID backlogs need easing. And during these interviews, he said that the nurses should be paid more for the jobs that they do. Now, he's gone a step further, Jason, here, and he says that in an interview yesterday, he seems to have said that he supports the nurses' strikes wholeheartedly. This isn't what Rishi Sunak is going to want to hear from someone who was a fairly high profile Tory supporter, and he can command the front pages like this. This isn't helpful, is it?
What the most important thing here, to my mind, Susie, is not that it's a famous name saying this. It's Rod Stewart, 78, it's his age. This is what's so fascinating. He is not alone in being a lifelong Tory voter who is now disenchanted with the Conservatives. The bulk of the Conservative support, overwhelmingly at the last two elections, was the over 65s. They were more likely to vote Conservative than anything else. Yeah, and the Tories rely on older voters to win. If they don't have them, they can't win the next election. So when Sir Rod and others of his age bracket are turning against the Tories, then the Conservatives should really start to be panicking, because if they've lost them, they haven't got a base.
No, exactly. Now, and of course, what do you think, everybody? Get into the questions, okay? Get into the comments and let us know. Do you think Rod Stewart's right? Do you think he's indicative, as Jason suggests, there of other 78-year-olds who have realised, people who grew up with the NHS, perhaps, and the early days of the NHS, and you just see there is absolutely no argument about this, that you just pay the nurses more, and that's that. We've got a 48-hour nurses' strike next week, Jason. The government is trying to move away from clapping for carers and clamping them in irons instead, because they're taking it to court and insisting that strike is illegal because it's exceeded the mandate that they got 6 months ago. But Rod says, I'm well on their side. I was absolutely with them. He said they come before anything. And he says they were absolutely right to down tools. If rich old Tories like Rod are saying it, how long... I suppose it's the same question you've just answered in a way, but how long is it going to take for the rich young Tories in government to realise that this is major? This isn't just Rod Stewart, like you say. It's millions of other people who are going to feel the same way.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. They've gone from clapping them to clapping them in irons. It's like with this court case. But I mean, these things are always delicate, and moods can swing very quickly. But the Conservatives, when this industrial dispute started, were still kind of under this illusion of like they're rerunning the kind of winter of discontent, which we'll come on to because it's referred to by John Bercow in his article as well in the Mirror today. And they thought that by standing up and being tough against the unions, it would be an automatic vote winner. What has kind of surprised them and kind of and caught them kind of off guard is actually the public have sided with the industrial action and have not taken the Tory line. And the polls are showing, I mean, it slightly depends on the dispute, but it's definitely in the case of the nurses and with the teachers that the majority support them going on strike for a pay rise, and they feel they deserve a pay rise. Yeah. And that's what's so interesting.
As Mike points out there, he says the health secretary has meanwhile announced he is suing the nurses that he used to clap. This doesn't strike me as in keeping with the public mood, largely in favour of paying NHS staff their worth. Rod has even said that he wants to pay for more MRI scans. He could do 30 or 40 a day by paying for an MRI unit, which he is happy to afford to do, which, seeing as he left the country, I think back in the 70s or 80s, in order to stop paying so much tax, is jolly decent of him. But he said, it's like banging your head against a brick wall. People are crying out for them and I can't get anybody to do it. What? Why not, Jason? If someone is offering to pay for the MRI scans that are diagnostic, that help people get the treatment they need in the right time and everything else, why aren't people biting his arm off to do this? Why aren't the NHS Trust saying, over here, please, Rod, we could do with one? Are they all just too busy striking, or have they had some kind of political order not to take his very outspoken help? Or am I being cynical?
I don't know the answer to that question, Susie, at all. I don't understand the inner workings of NHS management. It's always been a mystery to me. I'm afraid.
I suspect it's probably a combination of not quite knowing how that pay chain would work, how the paperwork would come through, and also perhaps not wanting the interviews outside your hospital, because that's what would happen, isn't it?
I think what it does feed into, which is kind of something I have from various conversations with my mother, who's more or less the same age as Rod, is this kind of real frustration that nothing seems to work properly. And you talk to people and they're trying to get GP appointments and they can't get them, and they're trying to get public transport somewhere and it doesn't seem to work, and then it's when they want a dentist appointment, but you can't find an NHS dentist, and it just goes on. And I think that's that real just like people are just constantly battling for services which used to be provided very efficiently, and I think that's partly what Rod has tapped into. Why aren't there MRI scans? Why has it got to this situation? But it's much bigger than that. It's across the board of every form of public service. In some way, it seems to be either broken or so much worse than it was when the Conservatives came to power 13 years ago.
Exactly. Everything's got a pothole in, isn't it? Effectively, every public service in some way has been allowed to go to rack and ruin and just rot. The weather gets in it and it gets worse and worse. Lindsay says, I'm an old fart. No, you're not, Lindsay. To me, the NHS is the one jewel in the crown this country has left, and kill it off at your peril. I think so, Lindsay, and that is definitely the comment of the day. So get into my messages and you will get the News Agenda mug. You just give me your address. Kirsty from the other day didn't bother to get in touch with me, so she hasn't got her mug. So, Lindsay, please message me and we'll sort one out for you. This is part of the problem, isn't it, I think, Jason? Because, back in the 70s, the last big wave of industrial action that we had, the 70s and the early 80s. And again, my parents would tell you the same kind of thing was happening. Nothing was working. You couldn't get a train. You couldn't make a phone call. The bills were going through the roof, inflation, blah, 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 all the rest of it. And it was strike, industrial action all the time. The whole country being ground to a halt. Labour was in power. Labour got the blame. And the unions got the blame. And the general public view, if you weren't in a union, was that it just wasn't terribly good. But now, fast forward 40 odd years, and we've got strikes. Everything's not working. You can't catch a train. Everything's potholed. The country seems to be going down the tubes. But the Tories have been in power for 13 years. And so the public have got quite a high level of support for the strikers this time round. And it's because blame is being apportioned differently, I think, isn't it? The same problems in a way, but we've tried nationalisation and it wasn't working in the 70s, and we've tried privatisation and now that's gone to hell as well. And there's just this general sense that we'd like the other guys to take over now and try it differently.
I mean, Ronald Reagan won the 1980 presidential election by asking the very simple question, do you feel better off than you did 4 years ago? And people said, no, they didn't. They inflation was soaring. Jimmy Carter had been a disappointment. And Labour's now asking the same question, do you feel better off 13 years ago? And 13 years is a lot longer to feel worse off, aren't they? And the Tories don't have an answer to that question. And until they do, it's going to be very hard to see how they can win the next general election.
Yeah, because the only people they can blame are civil servants and go, well, it's not our fault. We've tried to do it. We've just been stopped by the lawyers and the podcasters and the liberal media elite, and it's all someone else's fault.
Well,
it's running the country.
It's toffle-eating woke activists who are responsible for the decline of this country, not the people in charge.
Yes, they've gone
out.
New
elite, they're responsible, Susie. It's people like you and me, the new elite. We're responsible.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm very elite, being a single parent, state educated, mild disability. Yeah, that's me. It's my fault, everybody. Sorry, I've been personally stopping Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak all this time. Maybe they read my columns and decided that they read it and get so depressed they go, there's no point today, I'm staying in bed. Maybe if only that had actually happened, things might have gone a bit easier. Now, Rod's not the only one to turn his coat on this particular issue. And as Jason mentioned earlier, the case of former Speaker John Bercow, this isn't even the first time he's done it. Now, he's written in the paper today about how he became a Tory in the winter of discontent. And I suppose he's in his 60s, isn't he? I think maybe early 70s now. He's coming into Rod Stewart's age bracket a bit, although he's younger quite a bit, although probably about the same height. Horrified at all the strikes in the 70s, became a Tory, but now he's saying he's supportive of all these strikes and thinks they're 100% right to down tools while, as he calls it, defending themselves against a government that is hell-bent on cutting their pay. Now, Jason, is Sir John's intervention going to mean as much as Rod's? Is it indicative of a certain age bracket in the same way, or is this just John Bercow being John Bercow?
Well, I've just Googled while you were speaking, but he's 60, so that's very good.
Sorry, John. Sorry, John.
Young John Bercow. There's a slight problem with John Bercow, is that obviously he got badly censored for allegedly bullying behaviour. Yeah.
Yeah.
So his reputation is not, as good as it could be, which slightly undermines everything he says. But it's still fascinating that somebody who was very much on the right of the party when he joined the Conservatives, he was in the kind of, the hanging and flogging kind of clique of the Tories, has moved so far, and has seen the light, so to speak. And obviously we welcome all sinners and repenters.
Yes, well, it's welcome, of course, that he's changed his tune, and it's someone else, I suppose, which the Tories aren't going to particularly welcome having that news. Now, unfortunately, everybody, we've got a bit of breaking news for you, and I'm afraid it's very sad news. The former Strictly Come Dancing Chief Judge, Len Goodman, has died. He's passed away peacefully in a hospice after a short illness, where he's obviously been surrounded by his family and friends. Now, Jason, I don't know about you, whether you're a big fan of Strictly and ballroom dancing, but, that show has been on the telly for I don't know how many years now, 20 odd years. Len Goodman was a massive part of it for a huge chunk of that time. He went and did the US version as well. He's one of Kent's finest sons at the People's Republic, and he's going to be greatly missed, isn't he?
I'm a Strictly fan from the Len era. Does that make sense? He just came across as a genuinely nice bloke, didn't he?
Yeah,
decent, kind of old-fashioned values in a way, in a best possible sense.
Yeah, polished shoes and a smart jacket and a hold your lady properly. What are you doing? Kind of.
Yeah, and there was no malice there, and that's I think that's why the program worked, because he was so nice and kind of
And he genuinely cared, didn't he, as well? He cared about the dancing, and he cared about the dancers, and he cared about getting it right as well, the technique, and, not just having... I remember him saying when there were some sort of celebrity judges came on for a while, there was Alicia Dixon and a couple of others that a bit, they don't quite know what it is they're talking about. And, he wanted it to be absolutely right, didn't he? Which is no bad thing.
Yeah, that's really sad, because he was, he was an institution.
Yeah, another one lost, sadly. But we've still got Tony Beak, so it's not all awful. Although, unfortunately, there is no other Len Goodman. He was the best, and he's gone. And it's terribly sad. As we've seen,
when he said a 10, it meant something. That's it.
Yeah, a 10 from Len was proper. Yeah. Whereas now, when you watch Strictly, all you do is you wait for the last 2 weeks until Craig gets out his paddle. And when he finally got his 10 paddle out for Fleur, I was actually in tears because I was waiting for it for so long. Whereas Shirley, she gives a 10 out every 5 minutes. Yeah. She's just too nice in a way.
Yeah.
But anyway, R.I.P. Len. We're all terribly sad, and our best wishes go out to Len and his family. It's rotten news, but at least he's died peacefully and hopefully with his family around him, which is probably one of the better ways one can hope to go. And he brought a lot of joy to people while he was here. So thank you, Len. Now, we're going to need to move on now because somehow we've got to segue into something called good news. And we do have some for you. It happened over the weekend, and here it is. Now, if you've been living under a rock for the past few years, you might not know that 2 Hollywood stars bought the struggling Welsh football club, Wrexham AFC, a couple of years ago for £2 million, pocket money to them. This weekend, fans saw their side win the Football League for the first time in 15 years. Now, there was a pitch invasion. Ryan Reynolds says he woke up smelling of champagne and grass. People still don't know how to say Rob McElhenney's name. And half of Wales is in the best mood since Owen Glendower last rode over the hill. Jason, is this proof that if someone else believes in you and backs it with some money, of course, absolutely anything is possible?
The bit I've never understood here, Susie, why did they choose Wrexham?
They say this is why they chose Wrexham, because they could, I suppose they could make the difference. That, you know, a small club that really needed the help was the one to spend the money on.
I mean, I don't mean why they chose Wrexham, but just why did they go for a small little club? This is a bit...
I don't know. It could have been Gillingham, but they didn't want to come to Kent. Idiots.
Yeah.
But no, it was Wrexham.
I mean, Gillingham's a lovely community club, and I enjoy watching Charlton beat them. But that's not the point. I'm just, it's lovely for Wrexham. I'm really pleased for them. And, you know...
Just not quite sure why they picked Wales as opposed to anywhere else. But they must have been the one that was up for sale and had the right things for them. There is a documentary about it, I think, on Disney, which I put up.
Yeah. And one day I'll work out which one's Ryan Gosling and which one's Ryan Reynolds, and my life will be so much happier.
Ryan Gosling's blonde. Ryan Reynolds is Deadpool. I mean, it's not difficult. Try and keep up. But of course, perhaps there's a message in there for the NHS as well. You know, if someone believes in you, someone puts the money in you, you can do amazing things. It just needs that belief to happen in the first place. Anyway, thank you for everybody for taking part in that today. Thank you, Jason, for taking us through it.
Thanks. Sorry about my internet.
Sorry about the internet, but we persevered. We got through it. It settled down in the end. Lindsay, don't forget to get in my messages and we'll send you a mug. If you're listening on podcast, please leave us a review so other people can find it. And thank you to Sam in the background who brought us the breaking news as well. And we'll see you all again on Wednesday, everybody, for another edition of the News Agenda. Till then, tatty bye.